covering the Chapter 16 recap today. Thank you for following this series, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Okay, let's see where. Okay, found it. This is taken from litcharts.com. The rain lasts for 4 years, 11 months and 2 days. As you recall from last episode, it just kept raining. Aureliano Segundo stays home for the entire time and slowly loses weight. Everything in the house is incredibly damp, even the humans. Proved when they find Ursula's back covered in leeches. Aureliano Segundo, locked in the house with young Aureliano, knows what Fernanda has kept secret from all the others. Aureliano is a true Buendia. Aureliano Segundo shows the children the old encyclopedias, making up stories as he goes along because he does not speak English. Fernanda fears that Aureliano Segundo will want to have sex with her while he is trapped at home. But she's incapable, suffering from severely painful cramps. I don't see what the problem is, Fernanda. That's your husband. She writes to the invisible doctors, hoping for an answer. Fernanda's happy that the rain keeps people from going outside because she feels that doors have been invented to stay closed. Yeah, Fernanda, she's had a very, restrained life, I would say. Like, everything has to follow a certain order. Colonel Herrineldo Marquez dies, and his funeral procession passes the house. The Buendia family watches this sorry spectacle. Even Ursula is present, blessing the young man she treated like a son and telling him that she will see him again when the rain stops, predicting her own death. As if there was an afterlife. Aureliano Segundo goes to the home of Petra Cortez to check on the animals, but they have all died in the floods. Petra Cortez has not seen him since the rain started. He stays for 3 months, getting up the will to go back out into the rain. He tries to seduce Petra Cortez again, but she refuses his advances. He returns home with his trunks, convinced that everyone in Macondo is waiting for the rain to stop so they might die. The Buendias run low on food. Fernanda's protests about Aureliano Segundo's indifference to their needs is emitted as a long drone of sound. Eventually, when Aureliano Segundo complains about the noise, Fernanda unleashes a long monologue of grievances about the life that she was... There are some typos in here. She has been forced to live by marrying Aureliano Segundo. Aureliano Segundo listens to her all day, not saying a word until she tells a fib, and he calls her out on it. Fernanda goes on humming. The next morning, Aureliano Segundo asks for an egg, oblivious that they ran out of eggs sometime before. Fernanda begins another monologue about men who are so self-centered as to ask for large livers when there's no food at all. He goes to show the children the encyclopedia, even claiming that Colonel Aureliano Buendia is featured there. He goes out to the porch to sit with Fernanda afterward. She continues her rant until he can bear it no longer, and he tells her to shut up. In a rage, he smashes as many breakables as he can get his hands on, leaves the house, and returns with some food for the family. Amaranta, Ursula, and Aureliano think the rainy time is fun, splashing in puddles and playing with the senile Ursula. Yeah, I still don't know where Fernanda is. She was so diligent about looking over the house and making sure everything is in its place, and then her kids are causing mayhem. Like she only cannot pay attention to her own kids. That's the only thing she has no control over. With the exception of Meme, who she has put under house arrest. Basically. Is Meme even still alive? I don't know. Around the third year of the reign, Ursula's mind has started to confuse the present with the past, and the children play along, making up imaginary visits from relatives who lived at a different time. but have long been dead. She takes incredible joy in being reunited with them all. Eleanor Segundo remembers that there is a large fortune buried somewhere on the property, waiting for its proper owner to appear to claim it. He consults Pilar Ternera about where it's buried. She can only tell him it is within a certain proximity of Ursula, who buried it. He digs up the courtyard to such a degree that the foundation of the house is weakened, but he finds nothing. Finally, one Friday afternoon, the rain clears and it does not rain again for 10 years. The condo is in ruins. The banana plantation and city has been deserted. When Aureliano Segundo finally returns to Pedro Cortez, he is so thin that she is convinced he is Jose Arcadio Segundo, the leader of the strike. In the bedroom, he finds a skinny mule who Pedro Cortez has been feeding the fancy linens of the house when no proper food remained. Okay, find ourselves in chapter 17. All right. Let's see if I can pull you guys down. There you go. So I'm centered. It's a semi-long chapter. I'm going to use the bathroom real quick, and then I'll be right back with chapter 17. As always, thanks for watching. I will be right back. Let's do this. Okay. I should have a 3-part episode today. Also, the art show, I think, will be my last art episode this year. And that and the Fallout 76 episode should premiere on Twitch today, so stay tuned for that. Ursula had to make a great effort to fulfill her promise to die when it cleared. Waves of lucidity that were so scarce during the rains became more frequent after August, when an arid wind began to blow and suffocated the rose bushes and petrified the piles of mud. It ended up scattering over Macondo the burning dust that covered the rusted zinc roofs, the age-old almond trees forever. Ursula cried in lamentation when she discovered that for more than 3 years she had been a plaything for the children. She washed her painted face, took off the strips of brightly colored cloth, the dried lizards and frogs, the rosaries and the old Arab necklaces that they had hung all over her body. The first time since the death of Amaranta, she got up out of bed without anybody's help to join the family's life once more. Yeah, how would she even be able to see her own face? Like, her vision's been destroyed by the cataracts. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, again, where's Fernanda? What is she doing during when all this is happening? She's still arguing with Aureliano Segundo. I don't know. I actually don't know. Okay. The spirit of her invincible heart guided her through the shadows. Those who noticed her stumbling and who bumped into the archangelic arm she kept raised at head level thought that she was having trouble with her body, but they still did not think she was blind. She did not need to see to realize that the flower beds, cultivated with such care since the first rebuilding, had been destroyed by the rain and ruined by Aureliano Segundo's excavations. The walls and the cement floors were cracked, furniture mushy and discolored, the doors off their hinges, and the family menaced by a spirit of resignation and despair that was inconceivable in her time. Feeling her way along through the empty bedroom, she perceived the continuous rumble of the termites as they carved the wood, the snipping of the moss in the clothes closets, the devastating noise of the enormous red ants that had prospered during the deluge and were undermining the foundations of the house. One day she opened the trunk with the saints and had asked Santa Sofia de la Piedad to get off her body the cockroaches that jumped out and had already been turning the clothes to dust. A person can't live in neglect like this, she said. If we go on like this, we'll be devoured by animals. From then on, she did not have a moment of repose. But before dawn, she would use anybody available, even the children. She put the few articles of clothing that were still usable out into the sun. She drove the cockroaches off with powerful insecticide attacks. She scratched out the veins that the termites had made on doors and windows, and asphyxiated the ants in their ant hills with quicklime. The fever of restoration finally brought her to the forgotten rooms. She cleared out the rubble and cobwebs in the room where Jose Arcadio Buendia had lost his wits, looking for the philosopher's stone. She put the silver shop, which had been upset by the soldiers, in order. Lastly, she asked for the keys to Melquiad's room to see what state it was in. Faithful to the wishes of Jose Arcadio Segundo, who had forbidden anyone to come in unless there was a clear indication that he had died, Santa Sofia de la Piedad tried all kinds of subterfuges to throw Ursula off the track. So inflexible was her determination not to surrender even the most remote corner of the house to the insects that she knocked down every obstacle in her path. After 3 days of insistence, she succeeded in getting them to open the door for her. She had to hold on to the door jamb so that the stench would not knock her over, but she needed only 2 seconds to remember that the schoolgirl's 72 chamber pots were in there, and that on one of the rainy nights, a patrol of soldiers had searched the house looking for Jose Arcadio Segundo and had been unable to find him. "Lord save us," she exclaimed, as if she could see everything. "So much trouble teaching you good manners, and you end up living like a pig." Jose Arcadio Segundo was still reading over the parchments. The only thing visible in the intricate tangle of hair was the teeth striped with green slime in his motionless eyes. When he recognized his great-grandmother's voice, he turned his head toward the door, tried to smile, without knowing it, repeated an old phrase of Ursula's. "What did you expect?" he murmured. "Time passes." "That's how it goes," Ursula said, "but not so much." She's already seen like several generations of the family be born, history more or less repeat itself. Even the kids getting the same names, and she has actually seen history repeat itself. Like she's lived long enough, unlike Arcadio, to see how everything keeps happening over and over again. That's how it goes, Ursula said, but not so much. When she said it, she realized that she was giving the same reply that Colonel Aureliano Buendia had given in his death cell. Once again, she shuddered with the evidence that time was not passing, as she had just admitted, but that it was turning in a circle. Even then, she did not give resignation a chance. She scolded Jose Arcadio Segundo as if he were a child and insisted that he take a bath and shave and lend a hand in fixing up the house. The simple idea of abandoning the room that had given him peace terrified Jose Arcadio Segundo. He shouted that there was no human power capable of making him go out because he did not want to see the train, with 200 cars loaded with dead people, which left Macondo every day at dusk on its way to sea. There were all those who were at the station, he shouted, 3,408. Only then did Ursula realize that he was in a world of shadows more impenetrable than hers, as unreachable and solitary as that of his great-grandfather. She left him in the room, but she succeeded in getting them to leave the padlock off, clean it every day, throw the chamber pots away except for one, and keep Jose Arcadio Segundo as clean and presentable as his great-grandfather had been during his long captivity under the chestnut tree. First, Fernando interpreted that bustle as an attack of senile madness, and it was difficult for her to suppress her exasperation. About that time, Jose Arcadio Segundo told her that he planned to come to Macondo from Rome before taking his final vows. The good news filled her with such enthusiasm that from morning to night she would be seen watering the flowers 4 times a day so that her son would not have a bad impression of the house. It was that same incentive which induced her to speed up her correspondence with the invisible doctors and to replace the pots of ferns and oregano, begonias on the porch even before Ursula found out that they had been destroyed by Aureliano Segundo's exterminating fury. Later on, she sold silver service pots, ceramic dishes, pewter bowls, and soup spoons, alpaca tablecloths. With them, brought poverty to the cupboards that had been accustomed to India Company chinaware and Bohemian crystal. Ursula always tried to go a step beyond. Open the windows and doors, she shouted. Cook some meat and fish. Buy the largest turtles around. Let strangers come and spread their mats in the corners and urinate in the rose bushes and sit down to eat as many times as they want. And belch and rant and muddy everything with their boots. Let them do whatever they want to us, because that's the only way to drive off ruin. But it was a vain illusion. She was too old then, living off borrowed time, to repeat the miracle of the little candy animals. None of her descendants had inherited her strength. The house stayed closed on Fernando's orders. Aureliano Segundo, who had taken his trunks back to the house of Pedro Cortez, barely had enough means to see that the family did not starve to death. With the raffling of the mule, Pedro Cortez and he bought some more animals with which they managed to set up a primitive lottery business. Aureliano Segundo would go from house to house, selling the tickets that he himself painted with colored ink, to make them more attractive and convincing. Perhaps he did not realize that many people bought them out of gratitude and most of them out of pity. Nevertheless, even the most pitying purchaser was getting a chance to win a pig for 20 cents, or a calf for 32. They became so hopeful that on Tuesday nights, Pedro Cortez's courtyard overflowed with people waiting for the moment when a child picked at random, drew the winning number from a bag. It did not take long to become a weekly affair, for at dusk food and drink stands would be set up in the courtyard, and many of those who were favored would slaughter animals they had won right there on the condition that someone else supplied the liquor and music, so that without having wanted to, Aureliano Segundo suddenly found himself playing the accordion again and participating in modest tourneys of veracity. Those humble replicas of the revelry of former times served to show Aureliano Segundo himself how much his spirits had declined, to what degree his skill as a masterful carouser had dried up. He was a changed man. 240 pounds, he attained during the days when he had been challenged by the elephant and had been reduced to 156. The glowing and bloated tortoise face had turned into that of an iguana. He was always on the verge of boredom and fatigue. For Pedro Cortez, however, he had never been a better man than at that time. Perhaps because the pity that he inspired was mixed with love, because of the feeling of solidarity that misery aroused in both of them. The broken-down bed ceased to be the scene of wild activities and was changed into an intimate refuge. Freed of the repetitious mirrors, which had been auctioned off to buy animals for the lottery. From the lewd damasks and velvets, which the mule had eaten, They'd stay up very late with the innocence of two sleepless grandparents, taking advantage of the time to draw up accounts, put away pennies in which they formerly wasted just for the sake of it. Sometimes the cock's crow would find them piling and unpiling coins, taking a bit away from here to put there, so that the bunch would be enough to keep Fernanda happy, and that would be enough for Amaranta Ursula's shoes. That other one for Santa Sofia de la Piedad, who had not had a new dress since the time of all the noise. This to order the coffin if Ursula died, and this for the coffee which was going up. Send a pound in price every 3 months. This for the sugar which sweetened less every day. This for the lumber which was still wet from the rains, and this one for the paper, the colored ink to make tickets with. What was left over to pay off the winner of the April calf, whose hide they had miraculously saved when it came down with a symptomatic carbuncle just when all the numbers in the raffle had already been sold. Those rights of poverty were so pure that they nearly always set aside the largest share for Fernanda. They did not do so out of remorse for charity, but because her well-being was more important to them than their own. What was really happening to them, although neither of them realized it, was that they both thought of Fernanda as the daughter that they would have liked to have and never did, to the point where on a certain occasion they resigned themselves to eating crumbs for 3 days so that she could buy a Dutch tablecloth. Nevertheless, no matter how much they killed themselves with work, no matter how much money they eked out, no matter how many schemes they thought of, their guardian angels were asleep with fatigue while they put in coins and took them out, trying to get just enough to live with. During the waking hours when the accounts were bad, they wondered what had happened in the world for the animals not to breathe with the same drive as before. Why money slipped through their fingers. Why people who a short time before had burned rolls of bills in the carousing considered highway robbery to charge 12 cents for a raffle of 6 hens. Aureliano Segundo thought without saying so that the evil was not in the world but in some hidden place in the mysterious heart of Pedro Cortez. For something had happened during the deluge that turned the animals sterile and made money scarce. Intrigued by that enigma, he dug so deeply into her sentiments that in search of interest he found love, because by trying to make her love him, he ended up falling in love with her. Petra Cortez, for her part, loved him more and more as she felt his love increasing. And that was how, in the ripeness of autumn, she began to believe once more in the youthful superstition that poverty was the servitude of love. Both looked back then on the wild revelry, the gaudy wealth, the unbridled fornication as an annoyance. They lamented that it had cost them so much of their lives to find the paradise of shared solitude. Madly in love after so many years of sterile complicity, they enjoyed the miracle of loving each other as much at the table as in bed. They grew to be so happy that even when they were two worn-out old people, they kept on blooming like little children and playing together like dogs. The raffles never got far. First, Aureliano Segundo would spend 3 days of the week shut up in what had been his rancher's office, drawing ticket after ticket, painting with a fair skill a red cow, a green pig, or a group of blue hens, according to the animal being raffled. He'd sketch out a good imitation of printed numbers in the name that Petra Cortez thought good to call the business, Divine Providence Raffles. But with time, he felt so tired after drawing up 2,000 tickets a week that he had the animals, the name, and the number put on rubber stamps. The work was reduced to moistening them on pads of different colors. In his last years, it occurred to him to substitute riddles for the numbers, so that the prize could be shared by all of those who guessed it. But the system turned out to be so complicated and was open to so much suspicion that he gave it up after the second attempt. Aureliano Segundo was so busy trying to maintain the prestige of his raffles that he barely had time to see the children. Fernanda put Amaranta Ursula in a small private school, where they admitted only 6 girls. Wow. And she refused to allow Aureliano to go to public school. She considered that she had already relented too much in letting him leave the room. Besides, the schools in those days accepted only the legitimate offspring of Catholic marriages, and on the birth certificate that had been pinned to Aureliano's clothing when they brought him to the house, he was registered as a foundling. So he remained shut in at the mercy of Santa Sofia de la Piedad's loving eyes and Ursula's mental quirks, learning in the narrow worlds of the house or whatever his grandmothers explained to him. Who is this the son of? Aureliano Segundo, is that right? Meme and Mauricio. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, this is Meme and Mauricio's forgotten son, the same one that Fernanda was trying to keep secret. But I guess in this chapter, he's not so secret anymore. Um, yeah, so he is what they would call like an illegitimate son, or a bastard child, as sometimes they'd be called in former times, where it's like she had the child out of wedlock because outside of the marriage. Mauricio died before he had the opportunity to marry Meme. So yeah. Um, he was delicate then with a curiosity that unnerved the adults. But unlike the inquisitive and sometimes clairvoyant look that the colonel had at his age, his look was blinking and somewhat distracted. While Amaranta Ursula was in kindergarten, he would hunt earthworms and torture insects in the garden. Once, when Fernanda caught him putting scorpions in a box to put in Ursula's bed, she locked him up in Meme's old room, where he spent his solitary hours looking through the pictures in the encyclopedia. Ursula found him there one afternoon when she was going about sprinkling the house with distilled water and a bunch of nettles. Despite the fact that she had been with him many times, she asked him who he was. "I'm Aureliana Buendia," he said. Let's see, Meme herself is the daughter of Aureliano Segundo. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. So she is, well, Meme and Aureliano are Buendias. That's right, she replied, learning how to be a silversmith. She confused him with her son because the hot wind that came after the deluge had brought occasional waves of lucidity to Ursula's brain had passed. She never got her reason back. She went into the bedroom. She found Petronila Iguaran there, with the bothersome crinolines, the beaded jacket that she kept on for formal visits. She found Tranquilina Maria Miniata Buendia, her grandmother, fanning herself with a peacock feather in her invalid's rocking chair. Her great-grandfather Aureliano Arcadio Buendia, with his imitation dolman of the Viceregal Guard. Aureliano Iguaran, her father, who had invented a prayer to make the worms shrivel up and drop off cows. Her timid mother, her cousin with a pig's tail. Jose Arcadio Buendia, and her dead sons, all sitting in chairs lined up against the wall as if they were awake and not a visit. She was trying a colorful string of chatter together, commenting on things from many separate places at many different times, so that when Amaranta Ursula returned from school and Aureliano grew tired of the encyclopedia, they would find her sitting on her bed, talking to herself, lost in a labyrinth of dead people. "Fire!" she shouted once in terror. For an instant, panic spread through the house. What she was telling about was the burning of a barn that she witnessed when she was 4 years old. She finally mixed up the past and the present in such a way that in the 2 or 3 waves of lucidity that she had before she died, no one knew for certain whether she was speaking about what she felt or what she remembered. Little by little, she was shrinking, turning into a fetus, becoming mummified in life to the point that in her last month she was a cherry raisin lost inside of her nightgown. The arm that she always kept raised looked like a paw of a Miramonda monkey. She was motionless for several days. Santa Sofia de la Piedad had to shake her to convince herself that she was alive. Sat her on her lap to feed her with a few spoonfuls of sugar water. She looked like a newborn old woman. Amaranta Ursula and Aureliano would take her in and out of the bedroom. They would lay her on the altar to see if she was any larger than the Christ child. One afternoon, they hid her in a closet in the pantry where the rats could have eaten her. Again, where is Fernanda? Or Santa Sofia de la Piedad, for that matter. Like, they both should be in that house. Santa Sofia de la Piedad, though, would be a grandmother for them at this time, though. Yeah, I think Fernanda would probably be in the better position to actually do something about it. But yeah, who knows? It is Fernanda, after all. One Palm Sunday, they went into the bedroom while Fernanda was in church and carried Ursula out by the neck and ankles. Poor great-great-grandmother, Amaranta Ursula said. She died of old age. Ursula was startled. I'm alive, she said. And why aren't the kids in church? Like Fernanda's the only one who went to church, like, really? Yeah, I guess Fernanda goes by herself to church in that gigantic house with, like, literally dozens of kids and there's like a half dozen people in the house and she goes to church by herself. What? Like who else in that house right now? There's Ursula, right? There's Ursula. Aureliano Segundo and Arcadio Segundo, so that's 3. Santa Sofia de la Piedad, 4. Fernanda, that's 5. Amaranta Ursula, 6. Aureliano, son of Meme, 7. So there are 7 people in the house, and she goes to church by herself. Okay. It's actually even more surprising given the like very controlling personality that Fernanda has. Like, you can see, Amaranta Ursula said, suppressing her laughter, that she's not even breathing. I'm talking, Ursula shouted. She can't even talk, Aureliano said. She died like a little cricket. Then Ursula gave in to the evidence. My God, she exclaimed in a low voice. So this is what it's like to be dead. She started an endless, stumbling, deep prayer that lasted more than 2 days. By Tuesday, had degenerated into a hodgepodge of requests to God and bits of practical advice. To stop the red ants from bringing the house down, to keep the lamp burning by Remedio's daguerreotype. Never to let any Buendia marry a person of the same blood because their children would be born with the tail of a pig. Aureliano Segundo tried to take advantage of her delirium to get her to tell him where the gold was buried, but his entreaties were useless once more. When the owner appears, Ursula said, God will illuminate him so that he will find it. Like, we still don't know who put that statue there. Santa Sofia de la Piedad had the certainty that they would find her dead from one moment to the next. Because she noticed during those days a certain confusion in nature. The roses smelled like goosefoot. A pot of chicken peas fell down. The beans lay on the ground in a perfect geometrical pattern in the shape of a starfish. One night she saw a row of luminous orange discs pass across the sky. They found her dead on the morning of Good Friday. The last time that they had helped her calculate her age during the time of the banana company, she'd estimated it between 115 and 122. Yeah. She was old as heck. She outlived Amaranta. As a matter of fact, she outlived all of her kids, right? Yeah, she outlived all 3 of her kids. I would say that's highly unusual. Extremely unusual. She even outlived some of her grandkids. Good gosh. Yeah. Some of her great grandkids she outlived. Like, how often does that occur? Not all that often, really. Yeah, she lived quite a long time. Okay, let's see. They buried her in a coffin that was not much larger than the basket in which Aureliano had arrived. Very few people were at the funeral, partly because there were not many left who remembered her, partly because it was so hot that noon. The birds in their confusion were running into the walls like clay pigeons and breaking through the screens to die in the bedrooms. Yeah, it's like I think with the exception of Pilar Ternera, there really isn't anyone who would be able to remember her, right? That didn't die in the Colonel Aureliano Buendia Wars. B didn't die in the banana strike from the soldiers shooting them. And C didn't get washed away in the 100-year rain. Moses plague level rain that washed everything away. I guess it would be Noah, right? Noah level rain that washes everything away. Like who's even left at that point? Like Pilar Ternera, I think, is the only one who maybe would have remembered who Ursula is. At first, they thought it was a plague. Housewives were exhausted from sweeping away so many dead birds, especially at siesta time. Men dumped them into the river by the cartload. On Easter Sunday, the 100-year-old father Antonio Isabel stated from the pulpit that the death of the birds was due to the evil influence of the wandering Jew. He himself had seen the night before. He described him as a cross between a billy goat and a female heretic, an infernal beast whose breath scorched the air, whose look brought on the birth of monsters and newlywed women. There were not many who paid attention to his apocalyptic talk, but the town was convinced that the priest was rambling because of his age. But one woman woke everybody up at dawn on Wednesday because she found the tracks of a biped with a cloven hoof. They were so clear and unmistakable that those who went to look at them had no doubt about the existence of a fearsome creature similar to the one described by the parish priest. They got together to set traps in the courtyards. That was how they managed to capture it. 2 weeks after Ursula's death, Pedro Cortez and Aureliano Segundo woke up frightened by the especially loud bellowing of a calf that was coming from nearby. When they got up, there was a group of men. When they got there, a group of men were already pulling the monster off the sharpened stakes they had set in the bottom of the pit covered with dry leaves, and it stopped blowing. It was as heavy as an ox, in spite of the fact that it was no taller than a young steer, and a green and greasy liquid flowed from its wounds. Its body was covered with rough hair, plagued with small ticks. The skin was hardened with the scales of a remora fish. But unlike the priest's description, its human parts were more like those of a sickly angel than of a man, for its hands were tense and agile, its eyes large and gloomy. On its shoulder blades it had the scarred over and calloused stumps of powerful wings, which must have been chopped off by a woodsman's axe. They hung it to an almond tree in the square by its ankle so that everyone could see it. When it began to rot, they burned it in a bonfire, where they could not determine whether its bastard nature was that of an animal to be thrown into the river or a human being to be buried. It was never established whether it had really caused the death of the birds, but the newly married woman did not bear the predicted monsters, nor did the intensity of the heat decrease. Rebecca died at the end of that year. We all but forgot about her. Like, she was living in such seclusion that she was not mentioned for like several chapters. It's kind of like based on how she lived. She kind of died when her husband died, Jose Arcadio. Yeah, she just did not officially die until this point in the book. Arganita, her lifelong servant, asked the authorities to help for help to knock down the door to the bedroom where her mistress had been locked in for 3 days. They found her on her solitary bed, curled up like a shrimp, with her head bald from ringworm and her finger in her mouth. And notably, she outlived Amaranta. Sure she did. Reliana Segundo took charge of the funeral and tried to restore the house in order to sell it. The destruction was so far advanced in it that the walls became scaly as soon as they were painted, and there was not enough mortar to stop the weeds from cracking the floors and the ivy from rotting the beams. That was how everything went after the deluge. The indolence of the people was in contrast to the veracity of oblivion, which little by little was undermining memories in a pitiless way, to such an extreme that at that time, another anniversary of the Treaty of Neerlandia, some emissaries from the President of the Republic arrived in Macondo to award at last the decoration rejected several times by Colonel Aureliano Buendia. They spent a whole afternoon looking for someone who could tell them where they could find one of his descendants. Hardly anywhere. Like 3 chapters ago, they all were assassinated. I think all of his sons were killed. All 17 of them, miraculously. I think his only living relatives are... Does he even have any living relatives? I think the only relatives that are still living of his are his nieces and nephews. Those from Arcadio. Yeah, Jose Arcadio. Yeah, I think his sons died. I think he does. Whatever became of Aureliano was Jose. I don't know. Presumably he died with the other Aurelianos, though. Aureliano Segundo was tempted to accept it, thinking that it was a medal of solid gold. Petra Cortes convinced him that it was not proper when the emissaries already had some proclamations and speeches ready for the ceremony. It was around that time that the gypsies returned, the last heirs to Melchiad's science. They found the town so defeated and its inhabitants so removed from the rest of the world that once more they went through the houses dragging magnetized ingots, as if that really were the Babylonian wise men's latest discovery. Once again, they concentrated the sun's rays with the giant magnifying glass. There was no lack of people standing open-mouthed, watching kettles fall, pots roll, and who paid 50 cents to be startled by, as a gypsy woman put in her false teeth and took them out again. Broken down yellow train that neither brought anyone in nor took anyone out. That scarcely paused at the deserted station was the only thing that was left of the long train to which Mr. Brown would couple his glass-topped coach. With the Episcopal lounging chairs and of the fruit trains, with 120 cars, which took a whole afternoon to pass by. The ecclesiastical delegates who had come to investigate the report of the strange death of the birds and the sacrifice of the wandering Jew found Father Antonio Isabel playing blind man's buff with the children, thinking that his report was the product of a hallucination. They took him to an asylum. A short time later, they sent Father Augusto Angel, crusader of the new breed, intransigent, audacious, daring, who personally rang the bell several times a day so that the people's spirits would not get drowsy, who went from house to house, waking up the sleepers to go to Mass. Before a year was out, he too was conquered by the negligence that one breathed in with the air, by the hot dust that made everything old and clogged up, by the drowsiness caused by lunchtime meatballs and the unbearable heat of siesta time. With Ursula's death, the house again fell into a neglect from which it could not be rescued, even by a will as resolute and vigorous as that of Amaranta Ursula, who many years later, being a happy, modern woman without prejudices, with her feet on the ground, opened doors and windows in order to drive away the ruin, restored the garden, exterminated red ants who were already walking across the porch in broad daylight, and tried in vain to reawaken the forgotten spirits of his hospitality. I could have swore I was going to say Fernanda, but Fernanda's cloistered passion built an impenetrable dike against Ursula's torrential 100 years. Not only did she refuse to open doors when the arid wind passed through, but she had the windows nailed shut with boards in the shape of a cross, obeying the paternal order of being buried alive. The expensive correspondence with the invisible doctors ended in failure. After numerous postponements, she shut herself up in her room on the date, an hour agreed upon, covered only by a white sheet, with her head pointed north. At 1 o'clock, she felt that they were covering her head with a handkerchief soaked in a glacial liquid. The sun was shining in the window. She had a barbarous stitch in the shape of an arc that began at her crotch and ended at her sternum. Before she could complete the prescribed rest, she received a disturbed letter from the invisible doctors who said they had inspected her for 6 hours without finding anything that corresponded to her symptoms, so many times and so scrupulously described by her. Actually, her pernicious habit of not calling things by their names had brought about a new confusion, but the only thing that the telepathic surgeons had found was a drop in the uterus, which could be corrected by the use of pessary. The disillusioned Fernanda tried to obtain more precise information, but the unknown correspondence did not answer her letters anymore. She felt so defeated by the weight of an unknown word that she decided to put shame behind her and ask what a pessary was. I'm glad that Gabriel Garcia Marquez is finally defining his own terms, his own $10 vocabulary term. Only then did she discover that the French doctor had hanged himself to a beam 3 months earlier and had been buried against the wishes of the townspeople by a former companion in the arms of Colonel Aureliano Buendia. And she confided in her son, Jose Arcadio, and the latter sent her the pessaries from Rome, along with a pamphlet explaining their use, which she flushed down the toilet after committing it to memory, so that no one would learn the nature of her troubles. It was a useless precaution because the only people who lived in the house scarcely paid any attention to her. Santa Sofia de la Piedad was wandering about in her solitary old age, cooking the little that they ate and almost completely dedicated to the care of Jose Arcadio II. Amaranta Ursula, who had inherited certain attractions of Remedios the Beauty, spent the time that she had formerly wasted tormenting Ursula at her schoolwork. She began to show good judgment and a dedication to study that brought back to Aureliano II the high hopes that Meme had inspired in him. He had promised her to send her to finish her studies in Brussels, in accord with the custom established during the time of the Banana Company. That illusion had brought him to attempt to revive the lands devastated by the deluge. The few times that he appeared at the house were for Amaranta Ursula, because with time he had become a stranger to Fernanda. Little Aureliano was becoming withdrawn as he approached puberty. Aureliano II had faith that Fernanda's heart would soften with old age, so that the child could join the life of a town where no one certainly would make any effort to speculate suspiciously about his origins. Aureliano himself seemed to prefer the cloister of solitude, and he did not show the least desire to know the world that began at the street door of the house. When Ursula had the door of Melchior's room open, he began to linger about it, peeping through the half-open door. No one knew at what moment he became close to Jose Arcadio II in a link of mutual affection. Aureliano II discovered that friendship a long time after it had begun, when he heard the child talking about the killing at the station. It happened once when someone at the table complained about the ruin into which the town had sunk when the Banana Company had abandoned it. Aureliano contradicted him with maturity and with the vision of a grown person. His point of view, contrary to the general interpretation, was that Macondo had been a prosperous place, well on its way until it was disordered and corrupted and suppressed by the Banana Company, whose engineers brought on the deluge as a pretext to avoid promises made to the workers. Speaking with such good sense that to Fernanda he was like a sacrilegious parody of Jesus among the wise men, the child described with precise and convincing details how the army had machine-gunned more than 3,000 workers penned up by the station, and how they loaded the bodies onto a 200-train car and threw them into the sea. Convinced as most people were by the official version that nothing had happened, Fernanda was scandalized with the idea that the child had inherited the anarchist ideas of Colonel Aureliano Buendia, told him to be quiet. Aureliano II, on the other hand, recognized his twin brother's version. Actually, in spite of the fact that everyone considered him mad, Jose Arcadio II was at that time the most lucid inhabitant of the house. He taught little Aureliano how to read and write, initiated him in the study of the parchments. He inculcated him with such personal interpretation of what the Banana Company had meant to Macondo that many years later, when Aureliano became part of the world, one would have thought that he was telling a hallucinated version. This was radically opposed to the false one that historians had created and consecrated in the school books. In the small isolated room where the arid air never penetrated, nor the dust, nor the heat, both had the atavistic vision of an old man, his back to the window, wearing a hat with a brim like the wings of a crow, who spoke about the world many years before they had been born. Both described at the same time how it was always March there, always Monday. Then they understood that Jose Arcadio Buendia was not as crazy as the family said, that he was the only one who had enough lucidity to sense the truth of the fact that time also stumbled and had accidents, could therefore splinter and leave an eternalized fragment in a room. Jose Arcadio Segundo had managed, furthermore, to classify the cryptic letters of the parchments. He was certain that they corresponded to an alphabet of 47 to 53 characters, which, when separated, looked like scratching and scribbling, which in the fine hand of milk kids looked like pieces of clothing put out to dry in a line. Aureliano Segundo remembered having seen a similar table in the English encyclopedia, so he brought it to the room to compare it with that of Jose Arcadio Segundo. They were indeed the same. Eddie's about to begin. I'll be right back. I think we're getting close. 3 pages in the 17th chapter. Whew. Okay. Around the time of the riddle lottery, Aureliano Segundo began waking up with a knot in his throat, as if he were repressing a desire to weep. Petricotes interpreted it as one more of so many upsets brought on by the bad situation. Every morning for over a year, she would touch his palate with a dash of honey and give him some radish syrup. When the knot in his throat became so oppressive that it was difficult for him to breathe, Aureliano Segundo visited Pilar Tenera to see if she knew of some herb that would give him relief. The dauntless grandmother, who had reached 100 years of age, managing a small clandestine brothel, did not trust therapeutic superstitions, so she turned the matter over to her cards. She saw the Queen of Diamonds, with her throat wounded by the steel of the Jack of Spades. She deduced that Fernando was trying to get her husband back home by means of the discredited method of sticking pins into his picture, but that she had brought on an internal tumor because of her clumsy knowledge of those black arts. I think that's called voodoo. Since Aureliano Segundo had no other pictures except those of his wedding, the copies were all in the family album. He kept searching all through the house when his wife was not looking. Finally, in the bottom of the dresser, he came across a half-dozen pessaries in their original boxes. Thinking that the small red rubber rings were objects of witchcraft, he put them in his pocket so that Pilar Tenera could have a look at them. She could not determine their nature, but they looked so suspicious to her that in any case she burned them in a bonfire she built in the courtyard. In order to conjure away Fernanda's alleged curse, she told Aureliano Segundo that he should soak a bloody hen and bury her alive under the chestnut tree. Soak a broody hen and bury her alive under the chestnut tree. He did it with such good faith that when he finished hiding the turned up earth with dry leaves, he already felt that he was breathing better. For her part, Fernanda interpreted the disappearance as a reprisal by the invisible doctors. She sewed a pocket of casing to the inside of her camisole, where she kept the new pessaries that her son sent her. 6 months after he buried the hen, Aureliano Segundo woke up at midnight with an attack of coughing, and he felt the feeling that he was being strangled within by the claws of a crab. It was then that he understood that for all the magic pessaries that he destroyed, all the conjuring hens he soaked, the single and sad piece of truth was that he was dying. He did not tell anyone, tormented by the fear of dying without having sent Amaranta Ursula to Brussels. He worked as he had never before, as he had never done. Instead of one, he made 3 weekly raffles. From very early in the morning, he could be seen going through the town, even in the most outlying and miserable sections, trying to sell tickets with an anxiety that could only be conceivable in a dying man. "Here's divine providence," he hawked. "Don't let it get away because it only comes every 100 years." He made pitiful efforts to appear gay, pleasant, talkative, but it was enough to see his sweat and paleness to know that his heart was not in it. Sometimes he would go to vacant lots where no one could see him and sit down to rest from the claws that were tearing him apart from inside. Even at midnight, he would be in the red light district, trying to console with predictions of good luck the lonely women who were weeping beside their phonographs. "This number hasn't come up in 4 months," he told them, showing them the tickets. "Don't let it get away. Life is shorter than you think." They finally lost respect for him, made fun of him. In the last months, they no longer called him Don Aureliano, as they had always done, but they called him Mr. Divine Providence right to his face. His voice was becoming filled with wrong notes, getting only diminished into the growl of a dog. He still had the drive to see that there should be no diminishing of the hope people brought to Pedro Cortez's courtyard. As he lost his voice, however, and realized that in a short time he would be unable to bear the pain, he began to understand that it was not through the raffled pigs and goats that his daughter would go to Brussels. So he conceived the idea of organizing the fabulous raffle lands destroyed by the deluge, which could be easily restored by a person with the money to do so. It was such a spectacular undertaking that the mayor himself lent his aid by announcing it in a proclamation. Associations were formed to buy tickets at 100 pesos apiece, and they were sold out in less than a week. At another raffle, the winners held a huge celebration, comparable only to those of the good days of the Banana Company. Aureliano Segundo, for the last time, played the forgotten songs of Francisco the Man on the accordion, but he could no longer sing them. 2 months later, Amaranta Ursula went to Brussels. Aureliano Segundo gave her not only the money from the special raffle, but also what he had managed to put aside previous months. Little he had received from the sale of the pianola, clavichord, other junk that had fallen into disrepair. According to his calculations, that sum would be enough for her studies, so that all that was lacking was the price of her fare back home. Fernanda was against the trip until the last moment, scandalized by the idea that Brussels was so close to Paris and its perdition. She calmed down with the letter that Father Angel gave her, addressed to a boarding house run by nuns for Catholic young ladies, where Amaranta Ursula promised to stay until her studies were completed. Furthermore, the parish priest arranged for her to travel under the care of a group of Franciscan nuns who were going to Toledo, where they hoped to find dependable people to accompany her to Belgium. While the urgent correspondence that made the coordination possible went forward, Aureliano Segundo, aided by Pedro Cortez, prepared Amaranta Ursula's baggage. The night on which they were packing one of Fernanda's bridal trunks, things were so well organized that the schoolgirl knew by heart which were the suits and cloth slippers she would wear crossing the Atlantic, and the blue cloth coat with copper buttons, and the cordovan shoes she would wear when she landed. She also knew how to walk so as to not fall into the water as she went up the gangplank, that at no time was she to leave the company of the nuns, or leave her cabin except to eat, and that for no reason was she to answer questions asked by people of any sex while they were at sea. She carried a small bottle with drops for seasickness, and a notebook written by Father Angel in his own hand, containing 6 prayers to be used against storms. Fernanda made her a canvas belt to keep her money in. She would not have to take it off even to sleep. She tried to give her the chamber pot, washed out, lye, and disinfected with alcohol, but Amaranth Ursula refused it for fear that her schoolmates would make fun of her. A few months later, at the hour of his death, Aureliano Segundo would remember her, as he had seen her for the last time. She tried unsuccessfully to lower the window of the second-class coach, to hear Fernanda's last piece of advice. She was wearing a pink silk dress with a corsage of artificial pansies pinned to her left shoulder. Her cordovan shoes with buckles and low heels, sateen stockings held up at the thighs with elastic garters. Her body was slim, her hair loose and long. She had the lively eyes that Ursula had at her age, the way in which she said goodbye without crying but without smiling either. She held the same strength of character. Walking beside the coach as it picked up speed, holding Fernanda by the arm so that she would not stumble, Aureliano scarcely had time to wave at his daughter. She threw him a kiss with the tips of her fingers. I think they mean Aureliano Segundo, I think is what he means. The couple stood motionless under the scorching sun, looking at the train as it merged with the black strip of the horizon, linking arms for the first time since the day of their wedding. On the 9th of August, before they received the first letter from Brussels, Jose Arcadio Segundo was speaking to Aureliano in Melchior's room. Without realizing it, he said, "Always remember that they were more than 3,000 and that they were thrown into the sea." Then he fell back on the parchments and died with his eyes open. That same instant, in Fernanda's bed, his twin brother came to the end of the prolonged and terrible martyrdom of the steel crabs that were eating his throat away. 1 week previously, he had returned home without any voice, unable to breathe, almost skin and bones, with his wandering trunks and his wastrel's accordion, to fulfill the promise of dying beside his wife. Petra Cortez helped him pack his clothes and bade him farewell without shedding a tear, but she forgot to give him the patent leather shoes that he wanted to wear in his coffin. So when she heard that he had died, she dressed in black, wrapped the shoes up in newspaper, asked Fernanda for permission to see the body. Fernanda would not let her go through the door. "Put yourself in my place," Petra Cortez begged. "Imagine how much I must have loved him to put up with this humiliation. There's no humiliation that a concubine does not deserve." Fernanda replied, "So wait until another one of your men dies and put the shoes on him." In fulfillment of her promise, Santa Sofia de la Piedad cut the throat of Jose Arcadio Segundo's corpse with a kitchen knife, to be sure that they would not bury him alive. The bodies were placed in identical coffins. It could be seen that once more in death, they become as identical as they had been until adolescence. Aureliano Segundo's old carousing comrades laid on his casket a wreath that had the purple ribbon with the words, "Cease, cows, life is short." Fernanda was so indignant with such irreverence that she had the wreath thrown into the trash heap. In the tumult of the last moment, the sad drunkards who carried them out of the house got the coffins mixed up and buried them in the wrong graves. Wouldn't they be the correct graves, though? Because they switch name adolescents and they assume those identities. So in reality, Aureliano Segundo is actually Arcadio Segundo and vice versa. Like, they switch names to try to trick people, and they became those identities. They became those names. So in a funny way, it's like they were buried in the wrong graves, but I think in actuality they were the right graves. Like, it's actually Aureliano Segundo who was buried in the Aureliano grave and Arcadio Segundo who was buried in the Arcadio grave. Even though the names that they assumed would have been opposites. Yeah, in a way I'm glad they're gone, because their twin hijinks were annoying and just added to the confusion of characters naming their kids after themselves. If it weren't for the Segundos, like, it would have been even more confusing than it was. Like, all right, but that was chapter 17, 100 Years of Solitude. We're getting close to the end. I think there are 3 more chapters in the book, so we're definitely getting close to the end. Thank you so much for watching this series. Thank you for watching. And we'll be back with more to finish out the series. Thanks for the support.